The courtroom was already tired that morning, the kind of institutional fatigue that settles into old buildings where justice is processed like paperwork. Wooden benches creaked under shifting weight. Fluorescent lights hummed without apology. The public gallery held a scattering of people who looked resigned rather than hopeful, eyes down, phones half hidden, waiting for their names or someone else's mistake to be called. In this room, authority did not rush. It arrived early and stayed all day. Near the side aisle, a black man stood alone, that he wasn't dressed like the others. No visible anxiety, no restless pacing. He wore a dark, well-fitted suit, conservative, unremarkable, the kind that blended easily into formal spaces. His posture was straight, hands relaxed at his sides. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't recording. He wasn't causing a disturbance. He was simply there, waiting. The hearing had not yet begun when the first officer noticed him. It started with a glance, the kind that lingers just long enough to become suspicion. The officer leaned toward his partner, murmured something, nodded once. The two of them adjusted their belts and began walking, not quickly, not urgently, but with the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed. Their boots echoed louder than necessary against the tiled floor. "Sir," one of them said, stopping directly in front of the man. His voice was firm, practiced. "You're not supposed to be standing here." The man looked up, calm, almost curious. "I'm waiting for the hearing," he replied evenly. The officer's expression hardened slightly, the way it does when an answer doesn't fit the script. "This area is restricted. You need to step outside." Around them, heads lifted. Conversation stalled. A woman in the front row glanced back. Someone farther behind raised a phone just enough for the camera to catch light. The room felt smaller, tighter, as attention narrowed onto the exchange. "I have authorization to be here," the man said. His tone didn't rise. It didn't challenge. It simply stated a fact. The second officer stepped closer, closing the space between them. "Sir, we're not going to argue. You can leave now, or we can escort you out." The word escort hung in the air, polite on the surface, heavy underneath. The man hesitated, not out of fear, but as if measuring the moment. His eyes moved briefly toward the bench, still empty, then back to the officers. "This is unnecessary," he said quietly. That was enough. Hands touched his arm, not violently, but decisively. The kind of grip that signals the conversation is over. The officer gestured toward the doors. "Let's go." As they began to guide him down the aisle, a low murmur spread through the gallery. Phones came fully out now. A few people whispered objections, unsure of the rules, unsure of their place. The man did not resist. He walked with them, steady, dignified, his face unreadable. Just before they reached the doors, he spoke again, his voice carrying farther than before. "You should confirm," he said, "who you're removing." The officers didn't slow. They didn't ask questions. The doors swung open, flooding the room with hallway light as the sound of the courtroom spilled outward. To anyone watching, it looked familiar, routine, justified. Another man escorted out. Another moment of authority enforced without explanation. No one in that room knew yet that the hearing could not begin without him, and that the man being walked out of the courtroom was the judge. The hallway outside the courtroom was colder, narrower, stripped of ceremony. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder here, as if unconcerned with dignity. The officers released their grip once the doors closed behind them, satisfied the disruption had been removed from public view. The man adjusted his jacket slowly, smoothing the sleeve where a hand had pressed too firmly. "Wait here," one officer said, already turning away. "I won't be long," the man replied. The officer paused, glanced back. "That depends." Inside the courtroom, the murmur didn't fade. It shifted. People leaned toward each other, whispering in lowered voices, replaying what they'd just seen. A few checked the time. The bench remained empty. Court staff exchanged looks that carried unease rather than authority. This hearing was already behind schedule, and the absence at the center of it felt wrong. 5 minutes passed, then 10 that the bailiff stepped forward, scanning the room, confusion flickering across his face. He checked his clipboard again, then looked toward the doors. He cleared his throat, a small sound amplified by the microphones. "Please remain seated," he said, voice tight. "We're experiencing a brief delay." In the hallway, the man stood exactly where he had been told. He didn't pace. He didn't pull out his phone. He watched the flow of clerks and attorneys moving past, each one doing a double take, then slowing, recognition beginning to surface in their expressions. A young clerk stopped abruptly. Her eyes widened. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice instinctively. Are you waiting to go in?" "Yes," he answered. She hesitated, then leaned closer. "They told us you were already seated." The man allowed himself a thin, controlled breath. "Apparently not." Her gaze flicked toward the officers stationed farther down the hall. Understanding arrived quickly, followed by discomfort. I'll check something," she said, already backing away. Inside the courtroom, impatience grew teeth. An attorney rose halfway from his seat, then sat back down. A defendant shifted, chains clinking softly, eyes darting toward the bench as if answers might appear there unannounced. The air felt charged now, expectations pressed tight against uncertainty. One of the officers returned, irritation clear in his stride. "You can't be standing here," he said. "I told you to wait." "I am waiting," the man replied, gesturing subtly to the floor beneath his feet. The officer frowned. "What's your name?" The question landed late. The man gave it without emphasis. The officer blinked once. Then again. He pulled out his radio, turned slightly away, and spoke in a low voice. The response crackled back indistinctly. His posture shifted, stiffness replacing certainty. At the far end of the hallway, a senior court administrator appeared, walking quickly now, heels striking the floor with urgency. She stopped short when she saw him. "Oh," she said, the word heavy with realization. "Judge. We've been looking for you." The hallway seemed to contract around them. The officers straightened immediately. One cleared his throat. "Ma'am, this individual was, I know exactly who he is," she cut in, eyes never leaving the man. "And he's needed inside. Now." Silence followed, thick and unmistakable. The man met the officer's gaze, not triumphantly, not angrily, but steadily. The power shift was quiet, unmistakable. The courtroom doors opened again. When he stepped back inside, the room froze, every head turned. Phones that had been lowered came back up. A ripple moved through the benches, disbelief spreading faster than sound. The man walked alone this time, measured steps carrying him toward the bench. The officers remained behind, suddenly unsure where they belonged. He removed his jacket, draped it over the chair, and took his seat. Only then did he look out at the room. "Let's begin," he said calmly. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of what had just happened settling in. Outside the courtroom, whispers were already becoming messages, clips, uploads. The moment had passed, but its consequences were only starting. Authority had moved too quickly, and now it would have to answer for it. The hearing opened with procedural language, measured and neutral, but the room had not reset. It couldn't. The echo of what had just happened lingered in the air, threading itself through every sentence spoken from the bench. The judge's voice was steady, composed, yet the authority behind it felt sharpened now, not louder, just more precise. From his elevated seat, he looked down at the courtroom with new clarity. The officers stood near the side wall, where they had repositioned themselves instinctively, as if hoping proximity to the exit might make them less visible. Their posture was rigid, hands clasped, eyes forward. The confidence they had carried minutes earlier had drained away, replaced by a brittle formality. The judge began reviewing the docket, but his gaze returned to them again and again, not accusing, simply observant. He was watching how authority behaved when it thought no one important was looking. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed quietly. The clip had already begun circulating. Someone had filmed the escort from the gallery, the camera catching the calm resistance, the firm hands, the moment the doors closed. The caption was short, almost casual. No context yet. Just the image of power in motion. Inside, the judge paused mid-sentence. "Before we proceed," he said, setting the file down gently, "there's a preliminary matter." Every movement stopped. He looked toward the officers. "You removed an individual from this courtroom before the session began." One officer swallowed. "Yes, Your Honor. We believed he was unauthorized." "Believed," the judge repeated softly. "Based on what?" The officer hesitated. The room waited. "He was standing in a restricted area," the officer said finally. "We asked him to leave. He refused." The judge leaned back slightly. "Did he raise his voice?" "No, Your Honor." "Did he interfere with proceedings?" "No, Your Honor." "Did he pose a threat?" The officer's jaw tightened. "No." "Did you verify his identity before placing hands on him?" Silence answered. The judge nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he already knew. "Court authority," he said, "exists to protect process, not to replace judgment. When enforcement acts without verification, it becomes assumption wearing a uniform." He let the words settle. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. Attorneys glanced down at their notes, suddenly very focused on ink and paper. In the gallery, phones were lowered, but no one relaxed. This was no longer a hearing. It was an exposure, the judge continued, voice even. "This courthouse operates on rules. Those rules apply to everyone, including those tasked with enforcing them." He turned to the clerk. "Please enter into the record that court proceedings were delayed due to the unauthorized removal of the presiding judge." A murmur rippled through the room. The officer's face flushed. His partner stared straight ahead, expression frozen. The judge did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You acted quickly," he said. "But not carefully. And when authority stops asking questions, it stops serving justice." Outside, the clip gained traction. Someone added context. Another added a title. The comments multiplied, not angry at first, just incredulous. The calm of the man being escorted. The certainty of the officers. The sudden reversal. It felt familiar to too many people. Back in the courtroom, the judge addressed the room again. "This court will recess for 10 minutes. Gasps, subtle but audible. He stood, gathered his papers, and paused. "Officers," he said, "remain." The doors closed behind everyone else. In the near-empty courtroom, the imbalance of power shifted again, this time fully visible. The judge descended from the bench and stood at floor level, closer now, but no less authoritative. "You believed you were maintaining order," he said. "But order without understanding becomes exclusion." One officer finally spoke, voice strained. "We were following procedure." "No," the judge replied calmly. "You were following instinct. And instinct, unchecked, has a history in rooms like this." The words landed heavily, not accusatory, but undeniable. He straightened his jacket. "This isn't about embarrassment," he said. "It's about correction." The officers nodded stiffly, the weight of consequence beginning to press in. Beyond the courtroom walls, the video crossed from phones to feeds, from feeds to headlines. Commentary followed, then silence, the kind that comes when people wait to see what happens next. Authority had acted without accountability, now accountability was walking toward it, slowly, deliberately, and in full view. When the courtroom doors reopened, the atmosphere had changed completely. It wasn't louder. It wasn't chaotic. It was heavier, charged with awareness. Everyone understood now that what they were witnessing was no longer incidental. It was consequential. The judge returned to the bench without ceremony. He didn't rush. He didn't delay. He resumed his seat as if the interruption had been anticipated all along. The officers remained standing where they had been told, suddenly part of the proceedings rather than guardians of them. "Let the record reflect," the judge said, eyes forward, voice steady, "that this court is reconvened. Pens scratched faster. The clerk's fingers hovered above the keyboard, attentive in a way that felt sharpened by tension. The gallery leaned in almost imperceptibly. The judge did not begin with reprimand. He began with structure. This morning, he said, authority was exercised without verification, without inquiry, and without restraint. That authority belongs to the institution of the court. It does not belong to individual assumptions. He looked directly at the officers now. You believed your role granted you discretion beyond confirmation. It does not. The first officer shifted his weight. The second remained rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead. Neither spoke. The judge continued. You removed a citizen from a public courtroom prior to a hearing. You did so without cause, without threat, and without identification. He paused. That citizen, he said calmly, was me. The room didn't gasp this time. It didn't need to. The reveal had already occurred physically. This was the legal confirmation, the moment where power was named, not implied. In doing so, the judge said, you disrupted court operations, delayed proceedings, and demonstrated a misuse of enforcement authority. He turned slightly toward the clerk. Please note that this court is initiating an internal review of conduct. The clerk nodded, typing quickly. One of the officers opened his mouth, then closed it again. The judge raised a hand, not sharply, just enough. This is not a debate, he said. This is an accounting. He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the bench. Uniforms grant access, not judgment. When judgment is replaced by presumption, authority collapses into abuse. The words were measured, deliberate. Each sentence felt placed, not spoken. That I in the gallery, a man lowered his phone slowly, as if realizing he was no longer watching a moment but a precedent. A woman near the aisle crossed her arms, her expression unreadable but intent. The judge addressed the officers again. You will remain on administrative standby pending review. You will submit written reports by end of day. Body camera footage will be preserved in full. The second officer finally spoke. Your Honor, no, the judge said, calmly, without looking at him. You've spoken enough today through action. The authority reversal was complete now. Not dramatic. Not humiliating. Absolute. He turned back to the room. This court does not punish emotion, he said. It corrects conduct. Outside the courthouse, the story had already shifted tone. Headlines changed from disbelief to clarity. The man escorted out was no longer anonymous. His title appeared. His record followed. The comments slowed, then sharpened. This was not a viral outburst. This was a measured reckoning. Back inside, the judge concluded the matter. We will proceed with today's docket, he said. Justice does not pause for error. It responds to it. He struck the gavel once. Soft. Final. The officers stepped back, smaller now, not in stature, but in certainty. Their authority had not been stripped. It had been defined, narrowed, returned to its proper boundary. The camera phones went down. The room exhaled. The power had shifted not through confrontation, but through exposure, and everyone present understood something had changed, not just for those officers, but for the institution watching itself in real time. The consequences did not arrive with raised voices or public shaming. They arrived the way institutional consequences always do, quietly, methodically, and with a permanence that could not be argued away. By midday, the officers were no longer standing guard in the courthouse. Their radios had been turned in. Their access badges deactivated pending review. They sat in a windowless administrative office down the hall, separated now, each at a metal desk, writing reports that grew heavier with every sentence. Every word had to align with footage. Every justification had to survive replay, and the footage did not help them. The body camera showed exactly what the gallery had seen: no resistance, no disruption, no threat. It showed the judge's calm voice asking for confirmation. It showed hands placed without verification. It showed authority moving first and thinking later, supervisors watched the video without commentary. They didn't need to speak. The silence was instructional. By afternoon, Internal Affairs had been notified. Not because the incident had gone viral, though it had, but because the chain of authority had been breached publicly and procedurally. Removing a presiding judge from a courtroom without cause was not a misunderstanding. It was a failure. The courthouse itself reacted in subtle ways. Staff who had walked past the officers without a second glance now paused, eyes lingering, expressions guarded. The illusion of unquestioned control had cracked. In its place was scrutiny. Inside the courtroom, the judge continued his docket uninterrupted. He ruled on motions. He listened to arguments. He issued decisions with the same measured tone he had always used. But there was a difference now. Every exercise of authority felt deliberate, almost instructive, as if the room itself were being reminded how power was meant to function. At one point, a defense attorney stumbled through an objection, flustered. The judge waited, allowed him to gather himself, then ruled cleanly. No impatience. No dominance. Just clarity. The contrast was not lost on anyone watching. Outside the building, the story hardened. News outlets picked it up, not sensationally, but pointedly. The headline didn't scream. It stated. A judge escorted out of his own courtroom. Authority misapplied. Accountability initiated. Commentators tried to frame it as a mistake. Others pushed back, highlighting how rarely mistakes flowed upward. Civil rights attorneys weighed in, not angrily, but precisely. This was what unchecked discretion looked like. This was how easily dignity could be disrupted. The clip reached people who had never set foot in a courthouse. People who recognized the posture, the tone, the assumption. They didn't comment much. They shared it. Back inside the system, emails circulated. Policy language resurfaced. Training manuals were pulled from shelves and reopened. Not rewritten yet, but reread. By the end of the week, the officers were formally placed on administrative leave. The notice was brief. Neutral. It did not mention race. It did not mention public reaction. It cited procedure. That was intentional. The judge requested nothing publicly. He did not grant interviews. He did not appear on panels. He let the process speak. But privately, he insisted on one thing: the review would not be closed-door theater. All findings, he stated in writing, will be entered into record. The investigation expanded, not as punishment, but as examination. Who trained the officers? What protocols were emphasized? How discretion was framed? Whether verification was taught as optional or mandatory, answers emerged slowly. The officers' reports revealed patterns. Prior removals justified without documentation. Warnings issued without names taken. Authority exercised in gray areas that no one had bothered to define clearly. None of it was explosive on its own. Together, it was damning. The department responded the only way it could without losing legitimacy, by conceding structure, not intent. Procedures were acknowledged as insufficient. Oversight as inconsistent. Training as outdated. The officers were called in individually. Not to be yelled at. To be questioned. Why didn't you ask his name? Why didn't you verify with court staff? Why did you escalate physical contact without threat? There were answers. None were adequate. One officer admitted he assumed the man was an attorney who had wandered out of place. Another said he thought the judge would already be seated. Neither assumption justified removal. Assumption was not policy. By the following week, disciplinary decisions were issued. One officer received a lengthy suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, and a formal reprimand entered into his permanent record. The second, senior officer received demotion and reassignment away from courthouse duty. No one was fired. That, too, mattered. The response wasn't about spectacle. It was about correction with memory. Records would follow them. Promotions would not come easily. Every future evaluation would include this moment. Inside the courthouse, something else shifted. Officers began asking names again. Credentials were checked twice. Court staff were consulted instead of bypassed. Small delays appeared, not from confusion, but from care. People noticed, defendants noticed when they were spoken to instead of commanded. Attorneys noticed when officers deferred rather than decided. Judges noticed when enforcement waited for instruction instead of improvising. The judge who had been escorted out watched all of it quietly. He addressed the courtroom one final time on the matter, weeks later, at the end of a long docket. His words were brief. "This court exists to ensure fairness," he said. "That includes fairness in how authority is exercised." He paused. "Correction is not weakness. It is responsibility." Then he moved on. The story faded from headlines, as stories do. But inside the institution, it remained active, cited in training sessions, referenced in memos, remembered in posture. Authority had been checked without chaos. Accountability had been applied without vengeance. Consequences had landed where they belonged, and the system, for once, had been forced to look at itself without flinching. The courthouse didn't announce its reforms with fanfare. There were no press conferences, no banners, no declarations. Change in institutions like this moved quietly, through memos, revised manuals, and mandatory briefings. The incident with the judge, though brief in time, had left an imprint that would ripple for years. All courthouse personnel were required to attend a series of workshops focused on verification procedures, procedural authority, and bias awareness. The sessions were led not by external consultants, but by senior judges and veteran clerks. They walked officers and staff through real scenarios, emphasizing the moment when assumption overrode protocol, and how quickly dignity could be stripped. Videos from the incident were replayed carefully, dissected sentence by sentence, gesture by gesture, all for learning rather than punishment. Policies were rewritten with precise language. Authorized presence was now clearly defined, with multiple verification steps required before any removal of an individual. Officers were instructed to consult court staff, check credentials, and document every interaction. No assumption could replace verification. No instinct could replace authority. The internal review also prompted structural changes. A chain of communication was clarified. Officers would now report any removal requests directly to the bailiff or presiding judge when possible. Administrative staff received explicit instructions to intervene when an officer bypassed protocol. Supervisors were held accountable for ensuring adherence, with performance evaluations now tied to compliance rather than efficiency alone. Training became continuous rather than episodic. Officers assigned to courthouse duty participated in quarterly refresher courses. These were supplemented with real-world simulations, reenacting common and uncommon scenarios, including encounters with high-ranking officials, attorneys, and unassuming citizens who might test assumptions. The simulations emphasized calm observation, verification, and measured response. The cultural impact was subtle but persistent. Officers started double-checking details, asking questions rather than acting on instinct. Clerks felt empowered to speak up when authority overstepped. Judges were consulted proactively, rather than interrupted unexpectedly. Respect for process replaced reliance on presumptive power. Even outside the courthouse, the ripple spread. Local law enforcement agencies noted the case as a model for procedural reform. Training materials were circulated, and similar policies were adopted in other jurisdictions. The incident became a quiet benchmark. Authority must be accountable, oversight matters, and verification is not optional. And through it all, the judge who had been escorted out continued his work without a single public statement. His presence in the courtroom, calm and measured, became an example in itself. Officers, staff, and attendees alike learned that fairness was maintained not through intimidation, but through structure, observation, and clarity. A subtle but powerful shift had taken place. Authority would now operate under the weight of responsibility, with systems designed to prevent assumptions from replacing judgment. The courthouse was safer, more just, and more precise, not because of punishment, but because the institution had corrected itself at every level. The courtroom settled into its rhythm again, quieter now, but charged with a new awareness. Every sound, the gavel striking, the shuffle of papers, the murmurs of attorneys, carried weight. Not the weight of fear, but the weight of accountability, of dignity restored. People who had witnessed the incident weeks ago still remembered the calm precision, the quiet authority, and the lesson it left behind. The judge looked across the room one final time, not at the officers, not at the staff, but at the space itself, the benches, the aisles, the hallways where authority and citizens intersected. He understood that the moment had become larger than any one person. It had become a precedent, a reminder that power carries responsibility, that fairness is maintained through observation, not assumption, and that even small actions ripple into lasting change. The officers remained present in the courtroom that day, their posture measured, attention sharpened. They were no longer invisible enforcers of procedure, they were participants in a system that demanded clarity and respect. There was no humiliation, no shouting. Only a sober, undeniable awareness of accountability. Outside, the courthouse doors opened to the world, and people spoke quietly, thoughtfully, about what they had seen. Videos and accounts continued to circulate, but the narrative had shifted. It was no longer a story of power misused, it was a story of responsibility restored, a story of calm justice prevailing over instinctive authority. For those listening, reading, or witnessing the tale, the takeaway was clear: authority must always be questioned, verified, and measured. Dignity cannot be assumed, it must be protected. Moments of misuse may seem small, fleeting, or routine, but they carry the potential for harm. And when injustice occurs, the proper response is not reaction, but measured correction, systemic accountability, and lasting reform. This story serves as a reminder that each of us, in whatever role we hold, whether citizen, staff, or officer, bears responsibility for the way power is exercised. Stand firm when protocol is ignored. Speak up when assumptions replace judgment. Observe, verify, and respect the humanity of those we encounter. Justice is not instantaneous. Justice is deliberate. And it is always stronger when it is applied calmly, intelligently, and without ego. The judge returned to his work, the gavel struck lightly, and the courthouse exhaled, a space now defined by fairness, accountability, and the enduring truth that authority belongs to the system, not the individual.